Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today and welcome to the 10th webinar in the Keeping It Real series. So I'm Anna Richards, Commercial Lead at Vitaccess. I'll be moderating today and I'm joined by Mark Larkin, CEO of Vitaccess, Claire Edwards, Consultant at Odelle Technologies, and Stephen Haken, Founder and CEO of Odelle Technology. So to just give you a little bit of an intro to each of them, Stephen is a wonderful fella. He's got a PhD in mathematics and a bachelor's in physiology and anatomy. And over his career, Stephen has been awarded a very impressive 267 patents from NASA that are used today in medtech, radiotherapy, and AI. His work also includes 245 new procedure codes across the EU for surgical societies and early HTA advice in France and Germany to support market access for multiple digital technologies. We also have the very lovely Claire Edwards. She has 25 years of experience in life sciences across clinical research, sales, pricing, and market access for pharmaceutical, biotech, medtech, and consultancy organizations. In her previous role of EU Value Lead for the Medicines Company, she was responsible for market access of multiple products, development of market access strategies, the demonstration of economic value, and removal of access hurdles for launch or acquisition. So we're very, very happy to have these two guests on the webinar today. And just to give you a bit of a background, Odelle Technology is an established consultancy dedicated to helping medtech, biotech, and diagnostic businesses navigate the public and private healthcare sectors across Europe. So that's in order to secure the adoption and reimbursement of their technology. And last but not least, we have Mark, and he's got 20 years of experience in consulting, specializing in European pricing and reimbursement. He founded Vitaccess with the aims of harnessing the power of digital technology so that we can better represent the patient voice in drug development and market access. And Vitaccess, we are a patient-centric organization, research organization, where we combine scientific expertise and technology to provide real-world patient-centric solutions in digital research. So over the next 35 minutes, we're going to take you through the following topics. If we move to the agenda, to explore how using prospectively generated patient-centric real-world data can support access for medical devices. So you have here, Mark will touch on real-world data for supporting medtech value propositions and driving market access. And then Stephen will take us through frameworks for use of our real-world evidence for access and sources of real-world evidence and creating a toolbox. Then it's over to Claire to take us through some case studies and key takeaways. And this will be followed by a Q&A session. So you can put forward your questions to us in the Q&A box on the side panel. And if you've got any questions during the webinar, just pop them in there and we'll answer them right at the end. So I'm going to pass over to Mark first, one of the experts, to tell you a little bit more.
Thanks very much, Anna. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm really going to set the scene a little bit before passing over to Stephen and Claire. So what's the problem that real-world data can help solve in support of medical devices? So really to start with some of the basics. So it's quite broad, but there's a number of key things that we can do. One is targeting. So really understanding more about different types of patients, defining and stratifying potentially different subsets and subgroups of patients based on real-world characteristics. We can also identify therapeutic needs, and that can even include suspending some products that may not be conforming to existing treatments. And then finally, safety reporting is a key part of the use of real-world data. So particularly using digital tools, that can be quicker reporting, which can obviously be of benefit both to the patients but to manufacturers too. So in general, we could say that the use of real-world research and real-world studies can generate data outside of the framework of randomized controlled trials. And in so doing, there's a range of possibilities that can be harnessed. So one is just raising awareness, so with different stakeholders that we'll come on to. And that could be for diseases, it could be for the products themselves, and for patient populations. And perhaps crucially, there's a whole range of questions that can be addressed with real world research that's simply impossible to address within the constraints of randomized controlled trials. They're just different things. And finally, real world studies can help understand how products work in the real world setting. So a different type of assessment from what happens in randomized controlled trials. And fingers crossed that will lead to contributing to better health outcomes and hopefully cost effectiveness of new technologies in the real world setting. So how can real world data help demonstrate value propositions for new products? Well, this list could be a lot longer than it is, but we've just highlighted a couple of key uses of real-world evidence for medical devices. One's around epidemiological research and safety evaluations that I talked about previously. But again, outside the more selected environments of randomized controlled trials, there's scope to understand a range of epidemiological questions. The second one's about treatment patterns and healthcare utilization trends. So again, there can be a significant complexity to how technologies are used in the real world setting. Multiple treatments, multiple lines of treatment, multiple different products in different patients and subgroups. So there's a real complexity can be a real complexity to how that pans out in the real world, where sponsors perhaps don't understand all of those complexities, and that's where real-world evidence research can help. Comparative effectiveness research, comparing the effectiveness of different treatments that have been launched. Again, that's an area with significant complexity in and of itself. And then finally, for regulatory purposes, which Stephen's going to give us an update on some of the new frameworks for medical devices in a few minutes' time. So who's using real-world evidence today? I mean, it might have been simpler to say who is not using it. So in the work that we do at Vitaccess, we interact with a whole range of groups who are interested in using real-world evidence. So I won't read out all those boxes there, but one of the interesting things that we found is actually because there are different functional groups who are potentially interested in the use of real-world evidence, this is an opportunity for them to collaborate across groups, which perhaps sometimes they don't always do, which represents some opportunities, but also some challenges. And it's not just within functional teams of biopharmaceutical and medtech companies that we're talking about. There's also medical patient advocacy groups are very interested in real-world evidence use as well. So all that having been said, what's in it for these different stakeholders? What are payers interested in the use of real-world evidence? So of course, payers have to have in many ways an unenviable task of balancing trying to bring new technologies to patients, improving outcomes, but with budgetary constraints. And the tools that they have for making those evaluations are different from those typically used by regulators. And so clinical trials, which are designed for regulators, might be insufficient to answer the questions that payers have to fund technologies. So real-world evidence can be invaluable for payers in that context. For researchers, their toolbox has been expanded recently with which has enabled them to become ask questions that formerly they perhaps couldn't do, and that opens up the scope of what the type of real-world evidence research is to be far broader than it used to be. And so that means that they can ask questions about policies and services without the investment and even possibly even more important sometimes, the time that it takes to set up randomized controlled trials. And then finally, industry. What's in it for them? Well, real-world evidence can be an opportunity to show the value of products, an extra opportunity to show the value of products for patients, but also health systems in different countries and in different regions, as we'll go on to talk about. This can offer the opportunity for new collaborations with payers, which obviously have to be done in the right way, and potentially for new ways of accessing, of providing access and funding for those drugs, so new ways for pricing and reimbursement. So I'll pass over to Stephen. Who's still muted.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Anna. Thank you very much for that introduction. I think the slide in front of you is trying to describe to you the fact that regulatory authorities and notified bodies have begun using real-world evidence and real-world data in a number of different fields. So just to cap on, or to follow through on what Mark was describing, I think it's important to distinguish that real-world evidence is generated by analysing data gathered from routine clinical practice. And it can be used across the product life cycle, which is extremely important. It provides insights into areas including disease epidemiology, which has been mentioned, treatment effectiveness, and safety. And it also provides health economic value and impact. So monitoring and measuring the product's life cycle now is part of the regulatory framework in both the FDA and in Europe. As the new medical device regulations that were started in 2017, 2019, and installed in 2022 allude to. So real-world evidence comes from real-world data, and data relating to a patient's health episode or health status, and the delivery of a healthcare or an intervention that's routinely collected from a variety of different sources. So examples of real-world data include electronic healthcare records, patient registries, surgical registries, clinical coding data, and the devices themselves. Because real-world data reflects routine clinical care, this data and the resulting real-world evidence provides insights into medical devices, diagnostic products, and the performance and outcomes in a broad population. So what's happened with reimbursement is the European Medical Device Regulatory, or the MDR, it was posted in 2022, provided a post-market surveillance or a clinical follow-up of PMCF. And it's a data that's more closely linked to past market surveillance and the safety requirements of that device or that diagnostic. Medical device companies, PMCF studies, now have to include specific components that are identified in the MDR. All that that's saying is that you've got to have real-world evidence associated with the safety of the product. And approvals for PMCF studies will need to be obtained through not just ethics committees in some cases, but also through the competent authorities. The important thing I think to notice here is that this particular action of 2017, 2020, and 2022 has given birth to another set of actions, which I shall have given rise to an organisation in Europe. Go to the next slide, please. Which has given rise to another organisation in Europe called Real World Evidence for Decisions. And this entire initiative describes how the regulators and the HTAs work together. There are conflicting demands, and they can be addressed through joint development of common plans and joint scientific advice. But the best portal in Europe, I find, is the RWE4 decisions, and it's an initiative explored in particular with a group of people across Europe. And it's particularly useful in highly innovative technologies. So you might be looking at a closed loop system. You might also be looking at an innovative companion diagnostic. You might be looking at an orthopedic or a biologic or a new cartilage stem cell process. So it requires payers and HTAs to make decisions on small groups of evidence, on small portions of evidence, with incredible uncertainty. So the aim of this particular project, the RWE4 decision, is to go beyond the strategic intent to consider actions that all stakeholders could use to improve the real-world data they're collecting. And this is where real-world evidence is taking over the system. So the regulators and the autonomous bodies, or the regulatory bodies in Europe and the FDA, are now making portals for companies like medical device companies, pharma, to get involved in this project. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so depending on the country, the level of real world evidence differs. I suppose the weighting differs as well, and the type of the source. Electronic healthcare records are regarded as a primary gold standard source. Administrative data, hospital episode statistics, such as HSE in England, are regarded as a gold source, as are DRG codes, HRS codes in France. Clinical data insurance-based systems are slightly different, but there's also extremely useful registries. Now, a registry is an interesting thing because registries differ significantly across Europe, and the registry would have to normally be authorized by the commissioner or the payer. Patient-generated health data, if it's through an app, there are now over 450 pieces of regulation across Europe that govern apps and the collecting of data. So if it complies with that, it's fine. All of this is about building the right tool for the right objective. That's really what we're trying to do. We have to spend 55 minutes on figuring out the problem, 5 minutes on solving the problem. If you sit down and think about the problem, 95% of the time and 5% of the time solving it, you'll solve the problem, more than often not. So that's the only suggestion I've got in building a toolbox. Figure out all the particular problems of the axis of the problem and then simply solve it. And the only way to solve it, I believe, is to sit down with the commissioners, not their surrogates, but with the people who actually write the checkbook across Europe and take it forward that way. That's all I have. Next slide. Okay, leveraging capabilities of surgical robots. Claire, did you want to say?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. So what we wanted to do was give a couple of case studies. And what we've been talking about is the use of real-world data for various different purposes. And if anybody on the line is coming from the pharma background, you'll know that I think the use of real-world data in the pharma line is a little bit more advanced than on the medical devices and technology side, but we see it going in the same direction. And we've got a couple of examples here, but actually there are some themes that come through, which I will summarize once we've gone through them. So the first one is, as you can see, surgical robots. Now, this is not about developing real-world data to get surgical robots to the market. You obviously don't need to do that. That's not a requirement for market access. However, surgical robots do they give an opportunity to collect a huge amount of real-world data and which can translate into evidence for both hospitals, surgeons, and for payers. And the sort of data that can be collected as a result of surgical robots can help to improve performance and can help to improve standardization of performance at each hospital within a region. So they could be used to accelerate surgeon proficiency. It takes a certain amount of time for a surgeon to learn how to use a surgical robot. And so the data feedback that you can get from the robot can help to sort of target where there are mistakes and help to improve that proficiency. It can be used to monitor and benchmark performance. It can be used to monitor robot performance. So there's this huge amount of potential for performance and standardization. And then beyond that, there is the potential to monitor surgical outcomes, which really is the bit where, as people who work in market access, that's the bit where we're interested in, because this is where you get the data that monitor the safety in the OR, that can track post-surgical complications. If you can combine the data from the robot with cost data from the local area, you can actually come up with a financial analysis. So there's a huge amount of data that can be generated from these robots. But actually, and you'll see some quotes on this slide, and we just sort of cherry-picked a few that we thought were quite helpful to sort of summarize what the challenge is and what you need to think about. I think to sum up, it's that it's great to produce data, but you've got to think about what is that data going to do, how is it going to help, and how is the end user going to manage it. So if we look at the improving performance and standardization, we spoke to lots of surgeons and payers across Europe about surgical robots. And I've given you an example of the German here. So he says, yes, it's interesting, but it's not just about looking at performance and standardization. We've got to understand, how does the data that tells you how the surgeon is performing, so how much more movement is he making than, say, a professional or a novice? What does that really mean for patient outcomes? But then on the converse, we hear from payers, well, yes, we really want to know about performance. This is really valuable for us. And then on the outcomes side, we particularly liked this Irish example. Anyone who knows the Irish will probably find this quite funny. Data is like garbage. You'd better know what you're going to do with it before you collect it. And it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but the point is, the message that is being taken away from this is that it is great to collect data, but there has to be a reason for collecting it, and it has to be targeted to a potential outcome. And whoever is going to use it at the other end needs to know how to use it and how to make sense of it. So in other words, yes, payers, I think we all hear that payers, at whatever level they are at, whether they are a national HTA, a regional payer, they want outcomes data and they like performance and standardization data, but it has to be meaningful and it has to be usable. And something else that is very consistent across all of this is the interoperability of data. And a big challenge that is occurring now with coming through with real world evidence and evidence collection across the board is that a lot of systems are not interoperable. So it is very difficult to share data across systems. And there are a lot of rules and laws about data security and data protection. And that is changing globally. And it is changing quite rapidly, but it is something that needs to be considered. Also, any interface that is used to collect the data associated with the device or technology needs to be user-friendly. So we spoke to a lot of people who said, well, yes, it might have a great capability, but you know what, it's impossible to use, and we're busy, we're short-staffed, we don't have time to work this out. And then the last thing that we heard was that a lot of technology companies are fantastic at the initial support, at implementing initially their systems, but then they go away. And the problem is that in healthcare systems, staff turnover is very, very frequent. So actually that ongoing support is really very, very important to help that continue through as the staff turnover continues. So the takeaways from this are, yes, it's great to collect data. It has huge potential value, but there's no point just producing data. There needs to be a plan and it needs to be implemented appropriately. So moving on to the second one. So this is the potential of digital apps for collection of real world data. And admittedly, both of these examples are about generation of real world data by the technology, as opposed to use of real world data to support the launch of a technology. But the themes are very, very similar. So for digital applications and we'll all know that if you go to the app store on your phone, there's so many apps for so many things that we're literally drowning in apps. And that actually is one of the problems here that we have encountered when we've talked to people about reimbursement of digital apps. But the potential there is, if you can develop a digital application that enables collection of real world data on a disease or a condition that affects people within a healthcare, it's difficult to put a number on because it depends on what the geography is, but it's collecting data on an important condition. That is, of course, hugely valuable. It helps to inform treatment decisions. You can learn more about the condition, and you can use that data to demonstrate the benefit of your app in the real world. And so there's a lot of positives there that you can leverage using that application. We're seeing challenges, but in a way, the blue and the green are a little bit interchangeable here. These are just things you need to think about that we've come across as we've been working in this field. And I know that Vitaccess and Odelle as well, we've all worked quite extensively in this field. Number one is the volume of apps. So for example, there are loads of diabetes apps out there these days that are doing various different things. They might be sort of targeting the educational end, so they're used only by patients to help them to learn more about their condition, maybe change their behaviors, understand more about what they should eat and how that's going to affect their blood sugar, through to the apps that can actually be, they're moving towards actually helping to control insulin pumps. So, you know, they are quite different. And so you have to think about how those different types of apps are actually, how they actually interplay in the marketplace. Another big issue is data protection. So if you're wanting to get your app reimbursed, as opposed to just putting it out there and allowing patients to pay for it themselves or offering it free, then there are a lot of criteria that are required for reimbursement, and that is complying with data security, GDPR, making sure that the app is interoperable with other systems, so that if a patient, so for example, an app that a patient uses, but then the data is transferred to their healthcare provider, you've got to think about, well, how are they interoperable, and how do we actually make those interoperable between the two? As I mentioned, the reimbursement, and then the evidence, both the evidence that is needed to get the reimbursement, and by and large, it is looking at the moment as though it's more along the lines of the randomized controlled trials that are needed. I think Germany's a little bit different, but it is looking still more as though it's RCTs that are needed for reimbursement. But then the data that you generate using the app is, of course, this very valuable real-world evidence. So what we're saying here is that the considerations are, what is the type of app that you are developing, and what does it do? Are you wanting to get payment for that app? Are you wanting to get reimbursement? What software are you going to use? And this targeting of geographies, this is particularly important because different geographies use different types of software. And the requirements for data security and interoperability, they are all going to vary by geography. Therefore, it is extremely important that as you are developing the app, you think about, well, where do we actually want to play? Where can we add the greatest value? And where can the data that we collect through our app actually be leveraged, because the data security, GDPR, interoperability, they actually work together to enable you to leverage all of those data sets. So those two examples, they are quite different, but I do think that there are quite similar themes that come through between those. And I'm actually going to pass back to Mark to summarize that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Claire. So we tried to summarize this in what you've heard so far into two parts, really. What you might expect for conducting, if you're planning to conduct some real-world evidence research, and some suggestions as to what to do. So in terms of what to expect, I mean, as we mentioned a couple of times, the environment is in flux to a certain extent. So the regulatory environment, the regulations are changing. And of course, some of the digital tools, software, etc., are continually changing. So guess what? They're going to continue to change. So that's something you'll have to factor into your plans. And as we've mentioned here, what stakeholders want may change, and different healthcare systems may change in different ways. So that's a challenge. A fluctuating environment is a challenge, and hopefully what you've heard in the last few minutes as well is that there are different types of needs from different stakeholders, and there's a load of variability in regions, in countries, and in types of research that one could do. And again, that's not going to change either. That's always going to be there. And then finally, one of the trends is around digitization of healthcare. So we touched on at the beginning about the implications in terms of research methods and tools. There's some challenges in terms of data security, GDPR transfers of data, sharing of data, interoperability. But broadly, I think the increasing digitization of healthcare is, I think we're only at the beginning of that, and that's going to be that trend's going to continue over the medium to long term. So that sounds like those things to expect sound like quite a lot of challenges and difficulties. But what are some tips to try and put yourself in best position to conduct research? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, one suggestion is to start relatively early. Develop a plan. We've talked about the different variability of research methods and goals for research. So part of that plan should be thinking about what the end game is, what you're trying to achieve with research, to make sure you're then going to do it. Claire's talked about that, and Stephen talked about that as well. Understanding the problem. From that, you get a plan, and do that early, a couple of years from launch, ideally. Happily, though, there are some groups around who will be able to give you advice. That can take the form of both formal advice, so from regulators, HTA bodies, and as you may know, there are frameworks for getting that formal advice from those different stakeholders. So use those, and I would say there are some costs associated with doing that, but those are extremely small relative to the overall investment that you might undertake to do in terms of this type of research. And of course, there's informal advice from payers, from medical societies, etc. So if you have plans and you have not sought advice either informally or formally, and ideally both, then you open yourself up to far more considerable risk. So it's really worth taking the time, and that should be a key part of your plan that we talked about above. And then finally, seek out win-win partnerships, particularly regional partnerships have been found to be absolutely invaluable. Stephen talked about engaging with people who actually hold budgets, understand what they want, and then try and go and meet their needs. And so, form some meaningful partnerships with regions to build real-world evidence. And if you're able to do that, hopefully those will be some really strong starting points that will increase the likelihood of success for the research you want to undertake. So I think that's all of the formal part of the program, let's say. I'm going to pass back over to Anna for the Q&A.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you all. So yeah, we're now at the Q&A section, and we do have some questions that have come in earlier and today just now. So I'm going to put this one forward, and then whoever wants to jump on it, go for it. So I would be interested to know if the independent data collections of the clinicians who follow this standard practice can be evaluated as real-world data. If yes, which steps, such as approval from the ethics committee, are required to use these data as real-world data for medical device access? Who would like to go ahead with that one?
Stephen, go for it.
Okay, we've got that one. So I'm not on mute. I think the first thing to do is to make the hallmarks of evidence. That would be the first thing I'd look at. And you've got to look at the objective. So if the objective of your collecting data is X, then you've got to make sure that both sides of the equation are going to balance. So you've got to make sure that the evidence that you're collecting is relevant to the objective, and it's just not a peer-to-peer conversation. The conversation, if you're going to publish this information, has to meet scientific standards. So that's perhaps the best advice I could give you if you're going to publish the data, or who your audience is immediately. If you're going to submit the evidence to support the introduction of a technology, then it probably has to meet the criteria of several different standards. And you can find those available through a National Institute of Health Research in the UK, on the HAS in France, and there's several other sites that you can refer to.
So it depends what it's actually going to be used for and who the end approver is going to be, or the end user. So whether it is an HTA organization, a regulator, you know, what is the potential end use of that data, and then what are the standards that they require in order to make a decision? Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you both. I've got another question here. When we collect real-world evidence data, we need to be able to demonstrate the so what. What process or approach can be taken to help define the data to be collected, so we do not just suggest to collect everything we can think of?
Yes, maybe I'll start with that one. So, I mean, actually, the start of that question was a pretty good summary. So what? Yeah, you've got to. We've talked about thinking about the audience for research right from the start. Thinking about the research questions you're trying to answer, and then trying to build an evidence set which is as rigorous as it can be. You know, what are the criticisms that you might be open to with that audience? What are the uncertainties? What are the errors? You know, think about all those things. Publication, you know, Stephen touched on that as well. The rigor for publication in peer-reviewed journals is one part of a sort of quality framework. If you're not going to publish any of the data, are the people who you're going to send it to going to be convinced by it? And then the second part of the question about shall we, you know, how do you prioritize? I suppose certainly don't. It can be tempting when conducting building real world evidence studies as there's a greater flexibility perhaps than randomized controlled trials have. So that can be, and in some cases, an embarrassment of riches. But that can also be a massive trap where you're trying to fit everything into one trial, and actually, for various reasons, it might be overburdening patients, or you know, not being able to do the proper analyses. You may come out of it with nothing. So I think there's some really good things to try and build into your planning where you prioritize the research questions. You know, we have this with nearly all of the studies that we undertake with sponsors, where typically in the design phase, the research questions broaden, they multiply. And actually at some stage, we have to have a session where we talk with them and say, oh, okay, what are the most important ones? Because it might be the case, and typically with digital tools, there are some, there is the ability to do this, where you might be able to add some other research questions afterwards. But certainly if you're overburdening patients and patients are involved in the generation of your data, there's a massive risk for trying to do too much. So you absolutely do prioritize and just start off with the most absolutely vital questions that you want to answer.
I actually think, sorry, I was just as a comeback to that, because I was just thinking as you were speaking, Mark, that there is a difference between the data that you collect to support the value of your product versus the data that can be collected via your product.
Yeah, absolutely.
My two examples were mostly the latter, but actually, again, the themes are the same. So if you are collecting data to support the value of your product, you want to be targeted in what questions you ask and try to address for the regulator, for the payer, for the HTA. If your product is actually producing real world data, it needs to be targeted. And that's what we've heard from, like, for example, the surgical robots. There's no point just producing data. It has to be, what question is it addressing? Is that question actually a real problem? And is it relevant? You know, are the data that you're producing a relevant answer to that question? And I think it's actually still the same, no matter what the use of the data are.
And I think you've also got to rephrase, so what? So what can be, what is the significance about this claim? How does this enrich my understanding and everybody else's understanding? And what are the implications of this claim? And that to me is so what? So it's taking something as simple as these two words and rephrasing it more correctly or more succinctly. And I think that that's thinking about the problem, because to say so what creates its own problem. You have to contextualize so what.
Thank you, guys. So we're actually running a little tiny bit over, but that's all good. So thanks for staying with us up till now. I was going to say we've like to say a huge thank you to Claire and Stephen for speaking today. That was a lovely webinar, and we're going to wrap up now. We hope to see you next time. We're going to be doing another webinar in September, so keep your eyes peeled for that notification. And thank you everyone, and catch you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you.